Hi, Tia.
Hey,
How are you?
okay, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. We've got some applicants here who have interview offers from both Oxford and Cambridge, and I just thought we'd put a friendly face on the whole process. And everyone, this is Professor Thornton. She is a professor of Chinese politics here at the university. She was the former chair of the PPE committee, so she knows something about PPE. And she did interview me, so she knows something about interviews. So, did you have any remarks, Tia, about just interviews in general, or should we just jump into some
Uh,
questions?
no, we can just jump into some questions. I mean, the only thing that I would remind everybody is that each college does their own interviews, and therefore, the way that we do our interviews at Merton might not follow the exact pattern that you will experience. Is everyone applying for PPE or? Uh,
It's a good mix. Yeah, we have some E&Mers in here. We have a lot of PPEs. And I've actually asked, we have, I think, two merchant applicants. I've asked them not to ask questions as to avoid the impression of any bias or anything. So they've already pre-submitted their questions to me, so that we don't get any conflicts of interest. Um, I was just wondering, what do you think tutors are most interested in finding in candidates that they interview?
uh, I think that it probably varies tutor to tutor, but um, for most of the tutors that I know, the key issue is how suited people would be to tutorial teaching, because it's a very specific kind of teaching that is unique to Oxford. I mean, I have a son who went to Durham as an undergraduate, and he also had tutorials, but his tutorials were not the kind of tutorials we have at Oxford.
Hmm.
Meaning, in Oxford, for most tutorials, and certainly for virtually all PPE tutorials, at least, or all tutorials in politics, you will be writing an essay in response to a question by a tutor, and then you'll be presenting that essay in a group, a very small group, usually either a group of two, three, or four, no more than four. Whereas sometimes what they call tutorials at other universities, I'm sorry, I had a bowl of soup on this table and I spilt it everywhere in the 2 minutes before I logged on. So
Oh no, okay.
I'm just trying to stop the damage to the desktop. But anyway, yeah, what some other universities in the UK call tutorials are actually more what we think of as classes here. So that they would be in larger groups. For example, I think at Durham, my son said his tutorials had a dozen students in them, and that in Oxford would not be a tutorial. So the sort of teaching that we do, the tutorial type teaching, is quite unique, and it's definitely not for everyone. And that is the key thing, right? Because for example, I didn't attend Oxford as an undergraduate, and I would not have done well in a tutorial type setting. I just would not have done well. I wouldn't have been well suited to it because um, for a number of different reasons. I was quite shy, and there's a there you have to do a lot of reading and then be able to write quickly and also to think on your feet. And I wouldn't have done well when I was 18 with that kind of a teaching method. I preferred larger lecture type classes, and
Right.
maybe, yeah, larger classes. I would have been thoroughly intimidated to sit down with one or more uh, adult professors in a room
Sure.
and discuss my written work. Yeah.
Sure.
So at any rate, so the interview is like a mock tutorial. And I think what we're trying to do is assess a student's suitability for this style of teaching.
Right. So um, well, I have so many questions written out here. I'm just trying to figure out one that's great to sort of move on to. Um, what I guess more specifically to PPE, because I know it varies, like you said, by college and certainly by subject. But what how do you think a candidate should approach a question that they just simply don't know the answer to? And you know, we've sort of gone through a few workshops, and candidates have said that they've read all over the place that these interviews are not a test of knowledge. So
Yes.
what are they meant to do when they run into a difficult question?
Yeah, and that's a really really good question, because for example, I have a son who is 17 and a half. He's going to be 18 soon, and he's applying to read music at Oxford, and so he's now preparing to interview in music. And I don't know anything about music, and I don't know how the music department interviews. Um, but he had a mock interview. He just is at the local state school, but in his school they set up a mock interview. And when he came home and we were talking about it, um, he the tutor had given him a piece of music he'd never seen before, and he said that he identified it in his mind as being he's actually in the next room, and I'm tempted to just scream, but I won't. I think he identified it as a piece of, like, I don't know, like 17th century French harpsichord chord music. And but he was afraid he was wrong, so he didn't want to say that, and he said something else. And it turned out that his instinct was correct. Um,
Hmm.
but actually, uh, as we talked our way through how the interview then went on, what happened was, had he misidentified the music, we concluded that would have actually been the more interesting conversation. And the reason for that is because if, for example, in an interview, we set a problem in politics, which we sometimes do, um, and the student is, or the applicant is already familiar with the problem and knows the answer, that's not a very interesting interview actually for us. Um, it's much it's much preferable for us, because we want to actually have a conversation about it. So when you're presented with a question that you don't know the answer to, ideally you do not panic, and actually not only do not panic, but be happy that you don't know the answer to that question, because as I discovered with my son in talking through his mock interview, it's actually a more fruitful and interesting conversation if you don't know the answer to the question, because what the tutor wants to do is to find out how you think, basically. um, and I know as you're sitting there preparing for your interview, that's probably really intimidating to think about. But actually, what we want to do is we want to hear you think aloud. So how do you reason? You know, if you are confronted with something and you don't have any idea what it is, how do you, thinking out loud, figure out what it might be? What, how are you sorting a piece of factual information or data into a particular category? And you stick it in a French harpsichord music from the 17th century. Okay, why that? What made you think that? And that's the question. And then you're asked to explain why you thought that that was the appropriate category. And
Right.
the other thing to say about the interviews, just generally, but also in response to, the tutor gave me this problem and I had no idea what I was doing, and I'm sure I failed or something. Please never think that, because one of the other things that I've discovered from talking to my daughter, who read a different subject also at Oxford, and she went through an interview process, and she was really traumatized by her interviews, because she always thought that she was wrong.
Hmm.
But she, in the end, she did receive an offer of admission. But invariably, when I discussed with her the other students who with whom she was interviewing, many of them thought they'd done really well, but then they didn't receive admissions offers. Whereas some of the students who actually left the interviews crying or whatever ended up being offered admission. And in part, that's because it's in our human nature that if we're asked a question and we don't know the answer and we don't get it right, and the person who does has the answer have the answer corrects us, we feel we've made a mistake. But actually, it's generally what the way that the interviews are structured, at least the politics interviews, are we set a problem, or we're talking about something that with which the student is unfamiliar. The student guesses, the student gets it usually wrong, but we say, oh, that's interesting, why do you think that? And then the student begins to reason, and then once we arrive at some sort of a what looks like a consensus, we deliberately take away one of the parameters so that now you feel like you're wrong again. And then the idea is to have the student to sort, or the applicant, sorry, to sort through the other possibilities, and then just see where the logic train sort of takes us, if you will.
Hmm.
So the whole structure of the interview, uh, it, not by design, but may make people feel as though they've done something wrong and wrong again and wrong again and wrong again. But
Yeah,
actually, what's going on is the tutors are trying to assess how you're reasoning through a problem. And if we remove or shift the parameters, how do you reason again if we remove those parameters? Because we're really trying to drill down and see how you think. That's all.
absolutely. And yeah, that's really interesting because just like you alluded to, I mean, you can feel like you did terrible. A lot of the applicants in here, they said they thought they did horribly on their TSA, their admissions exam, but then
Mhm.
surely, I mean, they couldn't have done that bad. I have just, I suppose, like two more short questions for you, and then we'll turn it over to the floor for one or two questions from the audience. I was just wondering, sort of the dynamic of the interview. I mean, we understand that it's meant to be a tutorial already, which even if people are unfamiliar with it, it's more or less a class. It's a teaching and learning opportunity and a discussion with an expert in that particular field. But what should the length of answers be? No, considering the fact that some of these interviews are merely 15, 20 minutes long. I
Mm.
know that during some of the mock interviews, for example, applicants would give 3, 4 minute answers to what was meant to be a short question. So is there a particular dynamic that you personally appreciate out of, the out of the interview in general?
I would say some students, or some applicants seem to come in thinking that if they talk for a really long time, that they'll limit the number of questions asked of them. And it can be sort of a strategy for trying to control what is an unknown situation. But in general, those sort of really lengthy, meandering responses are not good. Because the other thing that the tutors must try to do is give everyone the same interview. So we generally march our way through a particular question or problem set. And if a student is intent on delivering 3 to 4 minute monologues in response to a question, it first of all delimits the conversation that might otherwise naturally evolve. And then secondly, it makes it really difficult for the tutors to give everyone that same interview. And the reason we do that is to give everybody their best shot. So I would advise applicants to try to keep their answers brief and to the point, um, as much as possible, and to be open and receptive to follow up questions or prompts from the tutors.
Okay, perfect.
And
Yes.
yeah, and so it is like a practice tutorial, but the big difference obviously between the interview and a tutorial is in a tutorial you have a common set of readings that you've done, and you've written a piece of work. So then the question is, how can we, taking a bunch of applicants from varied backgrounds, try to approximate that? And the only way we can do it is by setting a question or a problem and then leading you through this sort of oral exercise and just seeing where that leads us. So yeah, you don't in a tutorial. By the way, also Yo-Yo, we don't want 3 to 4 minute answers. Not that you do that. I'm not suggesting that you do.
Yeah, yeah,
Just for
yeah. No,
everybody
of course.
here, I haven't had him. We haven't been together in a tutorial yet, have we?
No, not yet, not yet.
Yeah. So I'm not suggesting that you do this, but
Yeah,
yeah.
no, no.
Also, in tutorials, I mean, we're having a conversation, and sometimes it's inevitable that people will go on longer. But yeah, in general, the idea is more we're trying to engage in a dialogue.
Right. I just recall that for at least one of my interviews, we sort of worked through the questions and we had a very fruitful discussion, but towards the end, it just had to be cut off. And I'm glad that we had apparently gotten through all the questions the tutor had wanted to, but had I provided answers that were too sort of rambly and, without end, I probably would have cut into the time I had to actually answer the questions and demonstrate my thinking skills. So just like just like you said, it's important to be concise, and it's actually probably part of showing how organized you can think by organizing your thoughts and providing a concise and sort of very responsive answer to the questions. Um, One more last question, and this one just kind of comes up a lot, which is, do you have to ask a question at the end? I mean, we know the question is no. I mean, the answer is no to that. Obviously, you don't have to ask a question, but what are some of the more interesting questions you've heard, and what questions like should people just not ask towards the end?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I mean, in my opinion, in general, do you have any questions for us? Is um, it's really just a perfunctory thing that we say to applicants to end the interview. If people actually come back with questions by the end of the interview, we generally don't have time to answer them. Um, Sometimes, rather than say, "Do you have any questions for us?" we may ask, why did you select this particular college? But we generally only do that if we're out of, if there's extra time left at the end. So do not feel that you need to ask any questions.
And it's certainly
My
not an opportunity to raise a new point to discuss, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah,
Right.
we're
Okay.
yeah, we're trying to wrap up. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. Does anybody have any questions for Professor Thornton? If you do, just feel free to raise your hand. Leona?
Oh yeah, so thank you, Yo-Yo and Professor Thornton, for this really wonderful Q&A session. I just want to ask one question. What do you think makes an outstanding interview? And by outstanding, I mean if other criteria has met a standard, this applicant will be almost certainly admitted.
The I'll just say also that the interviews are are um almost, I don't want to say almost never, but the interviews are rarely the determining factor. So if we look at the entire application, all of the scores and everything in order to build a composite picture, and then the interview is just that last little bit of detail, which is, can this person handle a tutorial type setting? And so uh, what makes an outstanding interview, and I've had some interviews that have been outstanding, and I've had other interviews that have been incredibly memorable for a whole host of different reasons. Um, I will never forget that there was one candidate who was not a PPEist, but I also interviewed for history and politics, and we were talking our way through a problem, and he was just so entertained with his own responses that he kept on saying, and but the other possibility is, and the other and he came up with so many potential answers and objections to his own argument. I started taking notes, actually, to be quite frank, because I thought it was so interesting. But then again, that person violated this 3 to 4 minute rule because he just kept talking. But he was actually, he was so entertained and entertaining, that I remember that as a positive interview, not as a negative. He did end up going on to do a DPhil at Oxford. That was several years ago. Uh, um, Beyond that, I wouldn't strive for, an outstanding interview, because again, I don't think the interview is generally, and that should be a comfort to most of you. Your admission is not generally going to hinge on the interview. It's extremely rare that would happen. Um, Generally, I would say the only time the interview is absolutely determinative is when you have someone who has presented very well on paper with really high test scores, but absolutely cannot cope with the tutorial type format. And in that case, we may have some misgivings, but trust me, sometimes we've actually admitted those people in the end anyway. So it's almost never determinative. So don't worry too much about having an outstanding interview. Just focus instead as much as you can on remaining calm and just trying to listen and with an open mind. And actually, the best thing to do is to go in well rested, completely calm, knowing that this isn't going to matter all that much one way or the other. Chances are very much in the favor it's not going to matter that much, and trying to see what you can get out of the experience. Meaning, what is a tutorial like? What are these people saying to me about this? What can I learn about whatever this thing is that they're asking me? So try to treat it like an educational experience.
Yeah, just building off of what sort of Leona was asking, and we had discussed this at the partial workshop we had yesterday, which is that the tutors have so much information about the applicants, and for home students, they have school profiles, they have, there's the predicted grades, some people have confirmed grades, you have some subjects with written work, you have the TSA, right? And there's all this stuff. So even though you shouldn't expect to go in and bomb your interview, surely, just like every other component, it's not the make or break moment for your chances of admission. We have
Yeah.
a question from Diana. Diana, do you have a question for Professor Thornton?
Yes, hello, good evening.
Hi.
I'd say this definitely ties into Leona's question, but I was wanting to ask how much weight is given to the interview as opposed to other factors like the TSA predicted grades. I know we've said it doesn't make or break your application, so you're not going to be, admitted just for having a great interview or rejected because you've had a rubbish interview, but just sort of quantitatively so us applicants can get an idea of what to expect.
So, yeah, again, the interview is only the interview. So you'll, if you're applying for PPE, particularly at Merton, you'll have 3 interviews, right? And um, the your admission is not going to generally is not going to hinge on your performance at any one particular interview, because as Yo-Yo has already said, the tutors already, we have your UCAS form. So we know what your actual grades are, your predicted grades are. We've read your letters of reference. There are a number of different metrics that give us an indication of what your background is, your socioeconomic background, how you performed at your school, what kind of a school it is, how you performed vis-a-vis your peers. I mean, all of this has been broken down into really detailed statistics, basically. And so, what we end up doing is we consider the applicant pool that we have, and then we take generally as many applicants, sorry, as we are able to interview, which is generally about 24 people out of that applicant pool, and then we invite them for an interview. But within that 24, we do have people who are already placed because of their composite statistics or whatever toward the top half, and others toward the bottom half. And the interview is just an additional piece of information that ultimately goes into the decision. And again, it's just not that, it's not very determinative at all. And any one of the interviews, I mean, you know, if it were going to be truly determinative, you would pretty much have to have you know, very high interview scores on 3 different interviews, and that almost never happens. I don't think it's ever happened in my experience. To be, if I can be absolutely frank, I've been doing this now um, for almost 14 years, and I've never, I don't think I recall ever having seen a candidate who has gotten superlatively high scores on all 3 interviews. So generally what happens is the interview scores get averaged.
Great, thank you.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll take a last question from Nakash, and then we'll yeah, Nakash.
Yeah, whatever. Okay.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and so on the kind of point about having 3 separate interviews, if you're in a if you're in a politics one, for example, and a certain issue raises a philosophical idea as well, would you maybe want to address that but not talk too much about it with your politics interviewers?
A philosophical question.
Yeah.
Um,
I think what Nakash is trying to ask, and Nakash, correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of when do we know if the question is literal versus metaphysical and all philosophically? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
because I think a lot of the applicants have been told that, especially for philosophy, if a question like what is good for us is asked, then we might want to first have a discussion about good and about what us means and things like that, and to explore the nuances and ambiguities. However, perhaps in a politics interview, the questions are to be interpreted more literally and more straightforward without the lefts and the zigzags, you know.
yeah. There is obviously within politics, there is a subfield that's quite close to philosophy, and that would be political theory. And so that there is a possibility that there would be a more political theory type dimension that would come up in, or which would be like a political philosophy type question that would come up in your interview, but you would be able to identify that pretty quickly. The broader trend in a politics interview is much more geared toward a social science type approach, which would be asking you to reason your way through, generally speaking, a cause and effect kind of a process, and with respect to a social or a political outcome, but using rational and possibly even empirical methods to do so.
All right. You know what? I think we have time for maybe one more question. I want to respect the professor's time, obviously. We have Eleanor.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, obviously, candidates have to come off quite enthusiastically, but we're all probably quite likely to be nervous as well. So can tutors quite easily differentiate between nerves and like not being enthused by the subject?
Yeah, please don't worry about that. I once did another interview. I did an interview with a woman, and it was one of the really memorable interviews that I've done, because she trembled so powerfully through the interview that we could feel it through the floorboards. The entire interview, she shook like a leaf, and with respect to trying to give everyone the same interview, this woman was so nervous. I think we got through half of the question, because she spent so much time trembling. Now that said, and I honestly I couldn't figure it out because she had an American accent when she spoke English. Like I couldn't even detect non-English influence in her language, so I couldn't imagine what was happening. But to be perfectly frank, she answered every question we put to her so thoughtfully and so interestingly, but very slowly. And very little was said because there was so much trembling going on. I literally thought she might die. But we did admit her in the end, and it was just she literally, her answers were very brief and to the point, but they were exactly the kind of answer that you would want to hear. I mean, it showed a really clear thought process was going on somewhere in all of that trembling. But she literally looked like she was going to vomit the entire time. And I think the interview went on for 25 or 30 minutes. I mean, we took the interview all the way up so that the next interview candidate was waiting outside the door already because she had said so little. Um, but yeah, what she said was good. We admitted her, and it turned out the backstory was she was American, but she'd been raised in Germany, and so she was thinking in German. And so what was happening was we were asking her questions, obviously in English, and she was translating that. She was hugely nervous. She was a profoundly shy person who was then translating the questions into German, thinking in German, and then slowly and carefully translating her thought process back into American accented English, which is what took so long, in addition to the nerves. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but yeah, I mean, we definitely account for the fact that people are nervous. Do not worry about being corrected or being caught out or saying, oh yeah. I mean, if you end up making an argument that turns out to be rather stupid, it's perfectly fine in the interview to say, well, that didn't take me where I thought it was going to. And then, let me see if I can start again. That's absolutely fine. I mean, we embrace that because that's a candidate who's not only thinking, but also reflecting on their own thought process in action. So, yeah, so that's fine as well. So, yeah, we allow for and we expect everyone to be nervous. I've had candidates remove clothing during their interviews and throw it on the floor. I had a candidate steal something from the top of the desk. I just, absolutely bizarre kinds of things that sometimes go on in these interviews, and they're actually never determinative of whether or not they are finally offered admission. Now that said, please don't steal anything from my. Oh well, we're doing online
They can.
interviews, so
It's
it's fine.
online.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, you can't steal anything. Yeah. Okay.
And I think the interviewees should be relatively at ease compared to previous years where people traveled to Oxford, had to meet with the professors in person in these antique rooms and ancient rooms, and had to sit in front of two people. I think a lot of people might take comfort in the fact that we're protected and separated by a computer screen, and I suppose people are used to learning on a screen already. So this is not much different from what you might have experienced at school already. Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor, and I think everybody found that very informative. and if anyone has any more questions, I'd actually ask them to contact me. I don't want anyone accusing us of giving certain people unfair advantages. So you guys have my contact details, and any other last thoughts to you?
Yeah, try not to be nervous. Try to sleep well, eat well, and relax before the interview, and go into it with an open mind, and to try it on as a learning experience. And then the last thing I would say is if you don't get an offer of admission, it is absolutely not the end of the world. It really, really isn't. I know it's Oxford, and so people think that they have to somehow go to Oxford or Cambridge, but you actually really don't. I didn't, and now I teach here, so you'll be fine. I had a son who went to Durham, and that was great, and it worked out really well. So yeah, try to just go with it, relax, be who you're going to be, and know that at the end of the day and at the end of your life, it's not the be all and the end all. You could get an admissions interview and you could hate it.
Yeah.
Right, Yo-Yo? You could go, why in the world did I decide to come to Oxford? It's so miserable. I have to write 2 essays a week.
I was just telling them that tonight, in an hour at the Oxford Union, the motion for this week's debate is this house has had enough of PPE.
Oh.
So
hopefully they mean personal protective equipment.
You know, that would be an interesting angle to it. That's up to us to define.
You can quote me as the former chair of the PPE committee. She counters that you must be talking about personal protective equipment. By the way, I don't run there is a Twitter account called PPE and PPE. Have you ever seen it?
No.
Yo-Yo?
No.
Okay, well you check it out. It's called PPE and PPE, and it's PPE alums from Oxford wearing PPE.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I mean, for Halloween, all the PPEists we wore PPE. We got masks and gowns and everything.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. That was our pun little costume. We have no creativity otherwise, so that was our one moment of brilliance.
No, I actually think that's pretty awesome. Actually.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again. I'm really glad we could make this work, and thank you again.
Yeah. Sorry about last night. Yeah.
No, that was my fault. That was completely my fault. And,
well, I mean, I should have been sat here online waiting, and then I contacted you. So, but I'm so glad we were able to rearrange. So thank you everybody for giving me another chance. I literally, Yo-Yo, I felt so badly about that.
You should have seen me. I was sweating. I was like, oh my God, the email didn't send. And yeah.
And I was sweating an hour and a half later when I got your email. I was sweating. I sweat all night. I'm sweaty and clammy. Yeah, I was up at 4 a.m. looking at my email. It was awful.
Oh, no.
So anyway, thank you for writing me back, Yo-Yo, and rearranging this. And again, I'm sorry to you all that it didn't work out last night, but thank you, those of you who did show up again tonight.
Great. All right. And we wish everyone luck at your interviews.
Yes, by all means. Good luck. And more important than luck or not luck, also, I hope you have a good experience.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.